Marcus Breen, and this is Boston Media Theory, and it's a program, as I'm sure you know, where we talk about media and communication theories and people who are working in and around that field in Boston. Researchers, advocates, activists, anybody who is making a significant contribution as best as we can see it. Today I'm delighted to welcome Tarleton Gillespie from Microsoft Research. I don't know if it's a centre yet or not, but Microsoft Research. And Tarleton is also a member of the Social Media Collective, which I'm sure you can explain to us, as well as an adjunct, but recently a full-time associate professor at the in the Department of Communication and Information Science at Cornell University. So welcome to Boston Media Theory.
Appreciate it.
We're going to do two programs, or 2 half hours, and the first half hour is going to talk about what we might consider the politics and struggles over new media and about new media. And then in the second half hour, we're going to discuss some of the issues to do with what it means to be critical in this space. So firstly, I wanted to just get your sense of how you see computer technologies connecting with politics. It's a very broad question, but how it might be specific to your field.
Sure, yeah, thank you. When I tend to talk about the politics of new media, I want to clarify that I'm not talking about the use of new media for politics, so for political movements or for campaigns or for involvement in the democratic process. What I'm talking about is I'm drawing the language of politics from, say, the area of science technology studies, where we think about the kinds of values that may be built into or embedded or reinforced by the kind of systems that we use. So if I want to think about the kind of social media platforms that we use today, and I wanted to think about the politics, what I'm interested in is how those platforms are designed, both technically, in the policies that they enforce, in the business models that they embrace, and how those designs then have implications for how we come to them, how we use them, and what consequences that has for public life or for whatever practices people are using them for.
Does that mean that there are some practices, to take your term, that are given a preference, a priority, and that's part of what this discussion should be about?
I think it could be thought of in terms of priorities. I like thinking about it in terms of how what looks like wide open discourse is subtly shaped by where it happens and who sponsors it.
Yeah.
And to me, this is while we're focusing on new media platforms, this is a very old question that media and communication scholars have cared about for a long time. If we want to be part of the public life, if we need information to be involved citizens, if we are engaging with the entertainment sphere and thinking about our own culture, that isn't just person to person, it isn't just person to content or idea, it's also happening amongst providers, distributors, platforms, and the choices they make about what they should highlight, what you're going to see first, what takes precedence, what appropriate participation looks like. That to me has consequences for what we tend to encounter.
Are we tending to encounter something that's been referred to in some of the literature as personalization to the detriment of the sort of serendipitous?
I think the questions about personalization were certainly the big first thrust on how to encounter this. So as people were moving their attention from traditional media forms, broadcasting and publishing, to thinking about search engines, news provision websites, and then social networking sites, that attention to personalization was a really important first step. To say, here is a logic that these technologies embrace, and it's presented as a very compelling logic, the news that's right for you, the topics you're most interested in, and as an exchange, that seems a perfectly reasonable one, right? You seek to know what I care about, and then you deliver to me the best materials. The questions that the scholars about personalization were asking were, that may be fine in each instance for each individual, but is that fine for the public? What happens when the information that we encounter is personalized, and that's a priority that's privileged in choices that are made and what we encounter. Recently I've been thinking about, I wouldn't call it the opposite, but I've been thinking about another tension. There's the personalization tension, so what happens when we get media that's curated for us, and parentheses, for what they think we are, right? which is an interesting distinction. Then there's a lot of attention now on recommendation systems. So what do we get based on what they think, who we think we're like? Are we like our friends? Are we like people who purchase things that, that we purchase? Are we like a certain genre of listener or a certain consumer of news? And then recently I've been trying to think a lot about a third one, which has often called trending. And so all of the times that a social networking site like Twitter, but also when you hit the New York Times and it says most emailed, most recommended, most read, it's another offer. It's an offer that says what you might want to pay attention to is what we say everyone is paying attention to.
Yes.
Very different than personalization, a little bit closer to notions of popularity and ratings, but different also because it's algorithmically resolved, because it's not clear who it's referencing or how it's being measured.
Sure. Okay, so there's a lot of material there in that answer of yours.
Let's unpack.
We'll get to them in a minute.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit to think about how these decisions are made for us, it seems to me that one of the challenges of a theorist is to be able to help students and the public and themselves understand just exactly what is going on behind the scenes.
Right.
Because what's interesting about computers is that basically they're rooms increasingly, well, once they were mainframes in a great big room somewhere, now they're little things called clouds, or big things called clouds in farms a long way away that we access to, but we really don't know much about what goes on there, do we?
That's true. That's true. I guess the way I've been thinking about it is that access to where decisions are made has always been difficult. So if we think about a very old concern in media, how do newspaper editors and reporters decide what to cover, what to put on the front page, what to give a big headline, and what to ignore? The challenge of figuring out why those decisions are made the way they are and what consequences they have involves either surmising or getting access to the editorial room where decisions are made. That's often difficult. They are corporate, they are hard to access, they have expertise that you may not be familiar with. So all the classic problems of trying to reach a point where decisions are made, and then is it even clear that that's where the issue is, right?
Yeah.
Is it that someone says yes and no, and that's, if only we could see them do it and ask them why they did it. So I think what's, in most ways, that problem has not changed.
Yeah.
When we think about the decisions that are made about what to present on Facebook or at the top of Google search results or how Twitter should be organized, that's still a question about people in organizations making decisions based on ideas about what their audience wants, what's right, what's going to make money for them, and how to put that all together. It doesn't happen in computers by themselves. It happens with people talking to other people using computers. There's an added level, which is oftentimes instead of pointing to, when journalists say, well, journalists do this or objectivity suggests I do that, and they point to kind of a vague concept.
Yeah.
Now these designers can say, well, the way algorithms work are. And so they can point to the technology as a justification or an explanation. Then you're faced with, well, how much do you have to understand about computing to be able to say something intelligent about whether that matters and how it matters.
Which gets to that difficult place where I remember many years ago, somebody said, well, engineers run the world. And in a sense it's gone to engineers and geeks or whatever, and mathematicians and so on, and that I think is part of that problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we've given up a lot and we've privileged that side of science.
Yeah, absolutely, and with that comes a set of expertise. So to be a sociologist or a critic of these requires then some kind of access to that expertise, but also kind of a worldview. I think that's what a lot of people are referring to. It's not just that a population of people are having power, but that a worldview that makes sense to that profession is being used not just to design circuit boards, but to design how we get our news, or how we find our friends, or how we hear about things happening halfway across the world.
Right. It reminds me of an interview I watched recently with Elon Musk, who is I'll call him the Tesla guy.
Yeah.
I know he's a lot of other things.
Yes.
He wants to go to Mars or something as well, but I'll leave that off the agenda for the moment.
Right.
And he was recently identified as somebody who has made a significant contribution and continues to make a significant contribution to the space and technology and I don't mean space as in going into space, I mean the technological space. And one of the points that he made in his interview was very instructive to me, and he was being asked about artificial intelligence. And what he said on more than one occasion was, you know, let's not worry about the artificial intelligence, let's understand who are the people who are directing the artificial intelligence. And I think it was an indicator, at least to me, that he's a very smart person who can do things, but he recognises his own agency, or the human agency driving the technology. And I thought, well, that's something of a relief, rather than a person who says, well, I'm just going to create these smart things that are going to take over human capacity, human intelligence, that are going to be sentient beings. It's not a happy place in some respects.
Yeah, I think that in the last couple of years, it certainly feels like the idea that we had for a long time that you could see in the fields of human-computer interaction and computer-supported cooperative work, where the interaction between people, programmers or operators, the tools like the computing, that relationship is what produces results. That, you know, in the sort of emergence of social media and the enthusiasm about Web 2.0 and the enthusiasm about artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things, all these sort of buzzwords and a lot of money behind those buzzwords, the idea of the tool by itself not only being what to focus on, but obscuring all the people, both the person in charge, right, the Elon Musks of the world, or the person who crafted the program, but also then the ongoing work, the real people who are, you know, answering at the call centers and tweaking the data and you know, making decisions about what to delete off a system. There remain people, right? And so people both orchestrating how the system should work and also maintaining how the system should work. They're rendered invisible by our language that says algorithms run the world, or, you know, technological platforms are changing everything. So I think we have to get a language back that highlights the give and take between both.
Sure, absolutely. We can talk about that. In 2007, however, you published a book called Wired Shut. And I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about some of the issues you considered in that book, which was of great interest to me as I started my career around internet studies coming out of the music industry. And that was, of course, to do with what's called convergence of one field and another all being collected into digital form, and then the digital, was it Millennium Copyright Act?
Correct.
And soon after there was a very interesting debate led mostly by Lawrence Lessig, now at Harvard, formerly at Stanford, who said, well, this is really an appalling way of tying down copyright, intellectual property, and restricting the opportunity for people to have access to culture. So where since 2007, which is a good number of years ago, where do you see that debate over intellectual property playing out? If you can, I know it's unfair to probably ask you to summarise it, but how you can see it playing out?
Well, so the book came out in 2007. That was work I was doing in sort of 2000, let's say dissertation on to 2005. So what I was really interested in was the debate that was happening in the first half of that decade, you know, driven by Napster and piracy and all the sort of hand-wringing. That's too dismissive. The anxiety about how the way we get music was changing. And I was interested in two things. So one was this turn towards design. You know, a lot of the copyright industries wanted to find ways to manage what you could watch, what you could share, what you could distribute, not through law by itself, but through encryption, through the device itself. So you can play a movie, but it won't let you download it. You can download it once, but it won't let you save it. You can save it once, but you can't save it 3 times. And this was a response to what was seen as just the floodgates that Napster and other peer-to-peer networks allowed. So this question that Lessig asked very, very powerfully: does East Coast code, does software code govern in the way that does West Coast code govern the way that East Coast code does? Does software govern in the way that law does? The other question that was animating it, though, was the debates about piracy, and the debates about Napster, and the debates about music were a really compelling place where I think we were first encountering the ramifications of not just the internet, not just the web, but kind of forms of participation and distribution that were emerging. And if you think about Napster not as sort of the death knell of music or, you know, piracy incarnate, but a way that people came up with interacting with each other around culture.
Right.
And if you just say it that way, just to like treat it as a neutral object for a moment, then you can see what happened next, which was companies that had very clear economic interest in the way that our culture moves around for us, reacting very strongly and saying that we have to intervene through law, through design, through norms, through any way possible. And so as we explore sort of ways of encountering culture, participating publicly, we run into stakeholders who have a vested interest in shaping how that works.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, the battles over Napster and, who downloaded a Britney Spears song and, can Google scan books, to me were proxies about who gets to decide how information moves around. And how are those political decisions, economic decisions, and how are they exerted, if you take Lessig's language, both through law and through code.
Yeah.
I think in some ways that the heat of that debate, it really was sort of a stepping stone, I think, for the questions we have now about social media platforms and all the ways that they structure the movement of information and the movement of people. I think copyright, in some ways, the debate shifted from the people doing something and the companies doing something else to different companies doing different things. Right. So as soon as Google started scanning books, as soon as Apple tried to sell music without DRM on iTunes, as soon as Spotify gained some traction, then the debate becomes competing business models. You've got institutions that both have the kind of heft where they can go to court and spend money and sue each other. And so to me, that question now of ownership, it's still hugely important. In some ways, we've let go of the radical idea that Napster represented. Now we can grab our music on Spotify or Pandora. We don't own it. We don't keep it. But it feels like we have access to almost everything. Right. That, to me, is the new question, because what platforms do very well is give you the impression that you get everything, when in fact you don't. But what you're missing is around the edges of a space that otherwise feels bountiful. YouTube feels full of videos. Facebook feels full of interactions. So the questions we used to have before about control and bottlenecks, where we'd say, wow, the TV networks only show us a slim view of politics. We can't make that argument anymore because there's a lot of stuff available to us. So now the question has to change, right? What are the sort of political ramifications of the way information is governed if it's not about a narrow bottleneck that only certain things get through?
In fact, it brings to mind a very important function for people who are doing the kind of work that you're doing and that those of us who are academics and researchers do, which is to draw attention to these precise limitations. Right. These sort of built-in limitations, and to say as best we can publicly, there are other options and other ways of gaining information.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that one of the things that our job is to do is to draw attention to what is very rapidly seeming normal.
Yeah.
So as soon as an arrangement seems normal, it has an incredible amount of power. It becomes self-justifying, and the either alternatives is one way to think about it, or those left out of the deal. It's harder and harder to notice those practices. It's hard to hear those voices. That's why a moment like Napster and everything blows up, or Facebook gets in trouble for doing something, those moments of controversy kind of at least pop open the otherwise seemingly normal way that information works.
Yes, and we haven't talked about corporations, but corporations, I think, are quite clearly, as we've seen through debates about trade, international trade, they are very, very powerful.
Absolutely.
Internationally powerful, and in a networked environment, remarkably capable of dominating the entire planet in certain areas.
Right.
So that's changed things a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, and trying to figure out the new forms of that power. Old forms like large-scale institutions have influence in Washington, D.C. That's a very old concern. Sure. It certainly pertains now. And then add to that new powers like global reach, like being able to stand as if they are mere conduits of information while also subtly shaping things. The kind of justifications and legitimations that they offer up as to why the services are what we need them to be, and how to then unpack those.
Yes. Do you think that there is a problem with younger people perhaps not appreciating the questions that they should ask about these kinds of these forms of closure?
I think we're all bad at asking questions about closure.
Right.
So
I'm just thinking about the way
Yeah.
it's naturalised, the way information is naturalised for younger people, sometimes referred to as digital natives, and whether or not they're actually, how they're brought into that critical conversation.
Yeah, I do feel like I agree in the sense that there's a power to being able to remember the way things were as a reference point to sort of challenge how things are. And if you were born into a world where Google and Facebook were commonplace, you don't have at hand that reference of how news felt or how information felt. At the same time, I think in some ways, that very benefit of you and I having been around long enough to be able to say, well, here was one model, that's not how it works, I can compare the two, means that we may ask old questions when there are new questions to be asked too. So how do we get out of asking the questions we got very good at asking in one form to really push the right questions and see possibilities and see constraints that are unfamiliar to us because we trained our questions at an earlier age.
That's true. So the historical perspective still counts.
Absolutely.
But how we adapt in this very rapidly changing and complex environment seems to me to be an important part of the challenge.
That's right.
The theory faces.
That's right.
In the time we've got left, I wanted to continue this sort of focus on what's happened with intellectual property, and the struggle over that, if you like, the struggle to keep it public or to keep culture public, and how that's been somewhat, if you like, determined or influenced by algorithms. Right. You've done a lot of wonderful work on algorithms, but I wanted to just spend a few minutes in the last little time we've got available now talking about, hearing about your view on algorithms.
Yeah. When you ask about the intellectual property, are you thinking about how IP and information is affected by the presence of algorithms, or even the IP of algorithms themselves?
No, more the former rather than the latter.
It's funny to me because a lot of the heat around the debates around copyright and IP that seem to be so driving the conversation in the last decade seems to have quieted down. But I think in part it's because we are now encountering so many of these systems, whether it's a streaming system like Spotify Music, whether it's Facebook and Twitter, where the question of we've almost let go of what things do we get to copy onto our own computers and then distribute on our own terms, because the information is sitting there and seemingly available, although that obscures the fact that things can go away and they're not under our control in a way they used to be. I think the debates now seem to be focused on what do the systems that organize information privilege? What do they surface? I think to draw the language out of the companies themselves, how those things are emerging, and then the question of like who owns them has disappeared a little bit behind who is in a position to make them visible or render them less visible. It doesn't make the questions of ownership go away, and I think probably there'll be a reckoning soon about the question, every algorithm is only an algorithm because it has access to data. And so the questions now may be the ownership of databases much more so than the ownership of specific pieces of content.
Right.
And those aren't just databases of content, that's databases of preferences, it's databases of profiles, it's databases of relationships between content.
Yes. Yeah.
And that battle about ownership has been happening, it's just been not, it's not in the cover of the weeklies.
Well, you make an interesting and important distinction too, or contribution in making the point that algorithms are not just about the code, not just about the mathematics and science of how a computer talks to another computer or software operates. It's actually closer to a worldview of how material is organized. Would that be right?
Yeah,
getting towards it?
There's something very precarious about the design of information algorithms in two senses. One is to design an algorithm that's going to make connections, make recommendations, serve up query results. You have to train it on a bunch of data. You have to teach it to find these recognitions. And where that data comes from and what it does and does not represent it, what it privileges, is going to subtly shape the tool. And on the other hand, you're going to then deploy that tool out into a world of data that you don't have yet, right? So if that's, like Facebook's news feed, you don't yet know which posts are coming tomorrow, that algorithm is going to then say this over that and this comes first. So it's an incredibly precarious, you build a system that's based implicitly on a set of data that has a certain shape, and then you deploy it into other data and see what happens. And that has to happen instantly, automatic, and for millions and millions of users all at once. So it's not surprising that we're running into these questions about why certain results emerged. And not only can critics not answer the question, but even the designers can't in some ways.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's new and tricky and fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah.
What discipline or what kind of people would provide some answers, some solutions to those kinds of questions?
The easy answer, but I think it's true, is that it's going to have to be the combination. It's going to have to be social scientists and critics and technical people. I think that each discipline has something to offer, and in some ways, being able to ask the right questions in a way that doesn't misunderstand the technology, and to learn to recognize these kind of like unorthodox results and where they come from, probably requires the combination of those people in some sense, if only reading each other's work or finding a language or collaborating. It's going to need to be people on both sides of that divide.
Because I suppose the irony of a much more complex environment is that sooner or later there's no answers from within the limitations of a particular field. Right? This is the classic interdisciplinary environment, isn't it?
That's right.
You can't answer a question as a mathematician necessarily if it's a humanistic question.
Right.
If it's an issue about how a human being responds to something.
Right. If you're within the technical frame, you're going to answer questions technically.
Yes.
And to find the places where the technical is playing with the public or the sociological is being built into the algorithmic, is going to have some kind of meeting point, or a new generation of students that have a facility across those divides that we haven't had before.
No, that's an interesting challenge for educators and for students. And I remember when Nancy Bain was here, I asked her about this question of how we go about some of these challenges, and I think it's very clearly a challenge that it sounds like Microsoft is trying to recognise in having this kind of research.
I think so.
Facilitation.
Yeah, I think we might be one way to imagine addressing that. Not the only one, but one way.
No. What other ways might there be?
I see colleagues in new departments that are trying to think about information studies in a way that forces them to sort of draw on expertise, not only from different disciplines that don't always speak to each other, but thinking across the theoretical and the applied. And I think I see, not just in those departments, but in the students that are coming to them. The students that are coming to them are the ones that want to find this understanding, that they don't want to come at this problem from only side A or side B. And so enough time making those spaces, inviting those kind of students to come in and build those connections is another way to do it. Not an easy one.
Not an easy one at all. And I suppose the question is how we then can provoke that kind of activity, knowing that we as an older, historically grounded generation have to let go of a lot. This is really quite a revolutionary sort of movement in academic circles, it seems to me.
That's right.
That you can't just say, well, let's keep doing something like create another department.
I think that's right. That's right.
Okay, well, Tarleton, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
This is fantastic, and we'll move on after a break to our second half hour discussion, but that's all for now. From me, Marcus Breen, and from Tarleton Gillespie, and from Boston Media Theory, thanks, and until next time, good night.